Now I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Roger Berry.
I'm really pleased to be here. I want to thank Dave Hoppy, who I think was the first connection to get me here. And then I worked with Wayne Brandt on a number of occasions. And I thank Wayne for your hospitality and Jim DeBoer for doing everything he could tonight to make this possible, make it comfortable. This is a real honor for me to be here. I also invited some guests that I can't recognize everybody, but I've got several people from Vermilion that have come over, and I appreciate you coming. Most of you are at my table. I have many friends from Yankton who are here that I see on a regular basis, and I appreciate them being here. I have a law school secretary, a former law school secretary, and her family here with them. I appreciate that. And Brenda's the current law school secretary, and her father-in-law, who lives in, not father-in-law, stepfather, I guess, lives in Utica, served during the Korean conflict. So he's a youngster here amongst us. I appreciate that. And coming from the farthest location, I think, for my friends, is Michelle and Kobe Lessman, former students. They graduated in 1999 and 2000, I think. You're a year apart, is that right? 2 years apart, okay. I have to tell you, when Michelle was a student, they hadn't been married yet, but her grandfather was very active in the National Guard or something in Sioux City, and he gave her to give to me his copy of Soul Survivor, which was autographed to him by George Gay. George Gay was the fellow who, the one torpedo squadron pilot, he was a pilot, who survived. He was shot down, of course, but he survived, and he was an eyewitness to the Battle of Midway. And he had an autographed copy, and I read it, and I photocopied lots of pages, and I wanted to have one for myself, and I hated to give it back to her, but I didn't. And so finally, in preparation for this event, I thought I'm going to get one of those books. Well, they're not readily available anymore. They're all collector's items, so I had to pay a little bit more than I would have otherwise. And the copy I got was autographed to somebody else, and it's really nice, but I want the one that was autographed to Michelle's father. Maybe we'll trade, I don't know. But I thank you for coming. I just mentioned briefly, my father was a veteran. He was a medic, and he served in World War II. He served in the Battle of the Bulge under George Patton, General Patton. And then when he got done there, he came back home, and they shipped him to Japan to serve there. And shortly after his ship left harbor, they had VJ Day, and he thought he might get to turn around and come back, but they sent him over, and he did 6 months occupation on Okinawa. And so I have lots of memories of my dad. One thing that he kept from his time as a medic, he kept a little kit that you get as a medic, and whenever any of us kids would get a tooth that needs to be pulled, he had the kit that would pull that, he would go and get these pliers that he used on people in the Army, and that's how he'd pull our teeth. So I have very vivid memories of having my teeth pulled by my dad, the medic, with his pliers that came from his Army medic kit. I'm not a veteran. I wish I were. I have a brother-in-law who flew helicopters in Vietnam, was there for the Tet Offensive. He died in the 1991 or so, and then my sister married another fellow from the same hometown that he was, and he was also a Vietnam veteran, and he still carries shrapnel with him that he received. My brother went to West Point, and he served in Germany. Mainly, that was his station of duty in the artillery. And I have an uncle who I was very close to growing up, and he was a Marine, and he was in the South Pacific. And he told us some fascinating stories, and I remember growing up, he had that tattoo that Marines get, on his arm, and would never go away. And one of the favorite stories I would hear is he was fighting on one of the islands in the South Pacific, and he took shrapnel, and so they took him out of action and sent him into a hospital and patched him up, and then asked him to go back. So he went back to service on the front line, and when he joined this new squadron of green recruits, or not green recruits, but people who hadn't been in action yet, the commanding officer welcomed him and had all these men lined up in their uniform, and he said, "We're glad you're coming back to join us. We appreciate your service. Is there anything I can do for you?" And my uncle said, "Well, yeah, I want a BAR." He wanted an automatic weapon because he didn't have one before. And so the commanding officer said, okay. And so he went down the line to the first soldier that had a BAR, and he took it from him and gave it to my uncle. Here's your BAR. And my uncle, he never regretted getting that. He kind of felt bad for the soldier he took it away from, but I'll never forget that story. Tonight I'll be talking a little bit about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. As you mentioned, FDR was a president. He was president elected for 4 terms. He only served for 12 years because he died very shortly after he started his 4th term. And he's the only president to have done so. There was a prior Roosevelt as a president. Delano FDR was our 32nd president, and his 5th cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, was our 26th president, and he served for 2 terms, 1901 to 1909. And it's kind of interesting, since we have Teddy Roosevelt on Mount Rushmore, as depicted on this very heavy aluminum sculpture over here, that Teddy Roosevelt actually was the uncle to Eleanor Roosevelt, who Franklin Delano Roosevelt met. And when they got married in 1905, Teddy Roosevelt gave away the bride. Her father, Teddy's brother, died when she was only 10 years old. So he actually walked her down the aisle. And yes, Franklin Delano Roosevelt married his cousin, 5th cousin, but that's what, once removed. That's the phrase I was looking for. 5th cousin once removed, so he did that. And I just want to tell you, and looking at Mount Rushmore, I don't know if you're aware of it, but the Federal Park Service has been doing a special lasering project for Mount Rushmore, and they've been using laser and laser techniques to capture the precise image as intended by the sculptor. And they've done this with lasers, and it's a way to preserve the sculpture as it goes through erosion. They're going to recreate it, and they have that defined by the laser techniques. And one of the side benefits from this lasering done by the Park Service is they've discovered that Teddy Roosevelt no longer needs glasses. You know, a few weeks ago, we had the 50th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And that certainly got a lot of news. And the big question that was floating around everywhere on Facebook and wherever you turn is, do you remember and what were you doing? And certainly most people who had that happen in their lifetime remembered that quite vividly. And I remember that also. I remember exactly where I was in the 6th grade classroom when we got the news. But I think the same thing is true about Pearl Harbor. And even though I wasn't born until 1952, as I was growing up, I constantly heard stories about Pearl Harbor. And my mother told me repeatedly that when Pearl Harbor was bombed and attacked, she got the news because she was at the Fox Theater in St. Louis. And in St. Louis, they had the radio stations broadcast into the streets for the public to hear the news of the attack of Pearl Harbor. And it certainly is a significant event in everybody's lives. Tuesday of last week, I received a phone call from a clerk for a federal judge in Kansas City. This judge is 90 years old. His name is Scott Wright. And he had heard that I'm coming here tonight to talk about these events, and he wanted to talk to me. And so we set up a phone conference, and I visited him for about a half an hour on Wednesday. And when he heard that Pearl Harbor was bombed, he was from western Nebraska. He went down to Kansas City and he enlisted, and he became a dive bomber pilot. And he didn't get there in time for the Battle of Midway, but he flew dive bombers in the Pacific throughout the rest of the war, and even got called into continued service after the war. And it was just fascinating talking to this gentleman who's 90 years old with the same enthusiasm that he had earlier, and the very vivid memory of events that he went through as a dive bomber pilot. The title to my presentation references Sleeping Giant, and this is not really historically accurate, and there's twice in my talks tonight I'm going to reference things that come from the film and movie industry that really isn't based on historical data, and one of them is the title. If you watch the film, the 1970 film Tora, 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 it ends with a scene of Admiral Isokuro Yamamoto, who was the commander-in-chief, saying, I feel all we have done is waken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. And then again in the more recent film, the 2001 film Pearl Harbor, they took the same quote and put it to Yamamoto, only they shortened it and they just simply said, I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant. The historians pretty much dispute that Yamamoto said that. And the more I've studied the events after Pearl Harbor, I doubt seriously that he said that. I don't think there was any trepidation or fear in Yamamoto or any of the Japanese as to the capabilities of the Americans. But I had to come up with a title on kind of short notice, so I thought, well, I'll grab that one and talk about that time period, the 6 months afterwards. And we've talked about the losses at Pearl Harbor, and you know, we're really fortunate in that none of our aircraft carriers were in port at Pearl Harbor, but our battleships were, and so we lost all of our battleships in the harbor at the time. My number that I've found is 5 battleships and 13 lesser ships, 2,400 servicemen, several civilians, 68 civilians. One of the reasons why we had so many deaths at Pearl Harbor was that on the Arizona, one of the Japanese bombs hit an ammunition magazine. And the book that I've read, the historical book by Admiral Nimitz, is that about 50% of the American deaths were as a result of that multiple explosion setting off our own magazine, ammunition magazine. And that's one of the hazards of war, is that your own munitions can increase the damage done by your enemy's bombs. And of course, we would use that to our advantage, or that phenomenon would be carried out to our advantage in the Battle of Midway, but that's what happened to us, and a major reason for such a large loss. I have a map of the Pacific that a very artistic student has drawn, and you've indicated the number of things that happened on December 7th. It wasn't just Pearl Harbor, although that was a major attack. The Japanese also attacked Midway, but they didn't invade it. But the Japanese did, and I tried to show in pink. I couldn't get red, but I got pink. The Japanese also attacked and invaded, took possession of Wake Island in the Pacific, and also attacked and took possession of Guam. And when they took possession of Guam, 21 deaths in Guam, and 483 POWs were taken by the Japanese. The Japanese would frequently take civilians as POWs in addition to military personnel. In addition to that, the Japanese launched attacks on Malaysia. Going after that, launched attacks on the Philippines, and started working on Indonesia. Japanese had already previously entered into a war with China. It had much Chinese territory, including the area that we now know as Korea. They have this large northern part of Manchuria, part of China, and there was still a large section of China, including Hong Kong, but they did launch an attack on Hong Kong also at that time. And the Japanese were just going to continually move down, but these attacks came right away. When the Japanese attacked Malaya, it destroyed a brand new battleship the British had there called the Prince of Wales. And the Prince of Wales offered no defense to the aircraft that destroyed it. It was swarmed by Japanese aircraft, and the admiral and the ship went down together with a cruiser that was there, also the Repulse. I think it's really important to see what assets were in the Pacific as a result of Pearl Harbor or after Pearl Harbor. And as I talk about this, keep in mind that neither side really knew what the other side had. This was wartime, and this certainly was not a time with advanced technology. So you didn't really, we have the advantage, because historically we have data that tells us this, we have the advantage of knowing exactly what was there. But everything else was in the fog of war and the cloud. And if you look at what Japan had in the Pacific theater after Pearl Harbor, it had 10 aircraft carriers. We had, at the time, immediately after Pearl Harbor, we only had 3 aircraft carriers in the Pacific. We had the Enterprise and the Lexington and the Saratoga. The Saratoga was torpedoed in January 11, 1942, about a month after Pearl Harbor. And although it wasn't sunk, it was put out of commission for an extended period of time, and it wasn't able to function again until after the Battle of Midway. So after the Saratoga was sunk, or not sunk, but torpedoed, in January, we only had 2 aircraft carriers in the Pacific, but eventually we were going to transition in the Hornet and the Yorktown from the Atlantic, and so they would come into our Pacific fleet. The Japanese had 11 battleships. We had no battleships in the Pacific. And I want to talk to you about the Japanese battleships. The Japanese battleships were by far the largest and most powerful battleships ever manufactured in the history of the world. Their battleships, the Yamamoto-style battleships, weighed 70,000 tons. And each of these battleships had 9 guns that were 18 inches in diameter. This is a very large diameter. The largest diameter that we had on any American vessel, on any American battleship, was only 16 inches. And what that means is, and the rounds that were fired out of these guns weighed almost 3,000 pounds. And what that meant was, if these 2 ships were to, and we didn't have any battleships, but if we did have a battleship and it approached the Japanese battleship on open water, the Japanese rounds would reach our vessels before we would. As a matter, our rounds would reach them. As a matter of fact, the range of the Japanese battleship guns was 6 miles further than the range of the American battleship. So the Japanese dominated tremendously in the category of battleships. But for the first time in naval history, the determination of victory in naval warfare would not be as a result of open confrontation on the sea, because for the first time in history, that victories would be determined by aircraft carriers that would launch planes to attack other aircraft carriers. That changed the whole concept of naval warfare with the introduction of aircraft carriers. But if we continue the count, Japanese had 22 cruisers, we had 8, 65 destroyers, we had 14, they had 81 support vessels, we had 4, they had 21 submarines, we had 4 or less. So if you just look at the raw numbers, the number of Japanese vessels on the Pacific Ocean were 210 and ours were 33. So it's more than it's about 6.5 times our vessels. If you compare the important top 2 categories, they outnumbered us by 7 to 1. They had 10 aircraft carriers and 11 battleships. We had 3 aircraft carriers, and that is an overwhelming odds for anybody. We had under construction at home in the United States 11 aircraft carriers, 15 battleships, 54 cruisers, 191 destroyers, and 73 submarines. And there's no doubt of the American spirit. I have at home in our house, I have one of the Rosie the Riveter's prints that was done to show the American spirit and how so many people went to work. But unfortunately, after Pearl Harbor was bombed, what was being under construction was absolutely of no help in the Pacific. The United States was confronted with this aggressive enemy and could only wage war with the assets that existed, and those were minimal. On January 11th, the Japanese also attacked Indonesia, declared war on the Netherlands because the Netherlands controlled that area. And so going after that large landmass, and also started its invasion of Papua New Guinea, which is, this is Australia, and Papua New Guinea is a large island to the north of Australia. And eventually the Japanese would take possession of all of Papua New Guinea except for a very small portion at the bottom. And the aggression was stopped at that time. The Japanese, Singapore, on February 15th, surrendered that part of Malaysia. And at that time, the Japanese acquired 80,000 POWs that were Allied personnel, and so it secured its quest to conquer Malaya or Malaysia. Five days later, the Japanese attacked Darwin Port in Australia. And it's reported, historically, this is the first and the most aggressive attack ever brought on Australia. The Australians refer to this attack on Darwin Harbor as Australia's Pearl Harbor. And basically, the Japanese had their way with the port exactly the way they did at Pearl Harbor, destroyed a tremendous number of Allied vessels. They didn't invade and conquer that, but the purpose of that was to clear the way so the Japanese could continue to take the rest of Indonesia and Java. Java is a very large island, and shortly after the attack on Darwin Harbor in Australia, the Japanese initiated invasion of Java. The invasion of Java lasted only about 2 weeks. It was started on February 28th and it was concluded on March 9th. The Japanese were seemingly unstoppable. Java, the population of Java is, my books tell me, is the size of the population of England. That's how large a population this large island country had that was invaded by the Japanese. And so we had continued aggression. We did have minor victories with a couple of our aircraft carriers defeating the Japanese, not really destroying any of the Japanese vessels, but stopping some aggression way out in this part of the Pacific at the Marshall Islands and the Gilbert Islands. And then later, about a month later in March, we had some success here in defeating or restraining the Japanese invasion of New Guinea. There was going to be a landing there, and we had some success there. But our successes were very minimal and not very effective at all for the first 4 months after Pearl Harbor, 3 or 4 months. Okay, in the background, we need to talk a little bit about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His mother, Sarah Roosevelt, Sarah Delano, actually is her name, Sarah Delano. Her father had an importing trade in Hong Kong, and she had spent a lot of time in China. And there was a very close connection between the Delano family and the Chinese. They had many friends and allies, close friends in China. She had traveled there as a child and spent time there. Sarah Delano, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was an only child, and they were very close, even to the point of his death. And his relationship with Eleanor, I don't know if it's because they're fifth cousins or what, but his relationship with Eleanor wasn't that great. They had separate homes and located pretty far away. And many times Sarah Delano Roosevelt would serve as the first lady during his terms in president. And so FDR was advised repeatedly as to the horrors taking place between the Japanese and the Chinese, the aggression of the Japanese. He was fully aware of the Japanese making a regular practice of bombing civilian targets and machine gunning innocent civilians. Also, the Japanese declared war, first had an invasion of the northern part of China in 1931, and then they turned it into a full-scale war in 1937. And the Japanese atrocities are just unbelievable when you read about them. It kind of made me sick just getting ready for this, reading the atrocities. The Emperor Hirohito had actually approved, and contrary to warning from the League of Nations, approved chemical weapons on 375 separate occasions, utilizing toxic gas in the war on the Chinese. This island of Hainan, which is, let's see where I'm at, right here. I think I've already covered it up. I covered it a whole time because it was taken control in it's a really large island. It was taken control in 1939, and the Chinese were so resistant to the invasion by the Japanese, they continued to provide guerrilla resistance, and the Japanese, in order to quash that, just rather arbitrarily went through the entire population and killed every third male. So 1/3 of the males on that island were killed by the Japanese, civilians or soldiers. Well, as a result of knowing the atrocities on China, FDR really wanted to deliver an impact on homeland Japan. Homeland Japan had never been attacked. Its soil had been sacrosanct, if you will, and they offered, they just were immune from any kind of attack. And Roosevelt kept, the phrase I've heard is kept badgering his chief of staffs, Joint Chief of Staffs, to find a way to bomb Japanese soil. He tried to figure out if there's a way you could fly from the friendly bases in China and cover Japan and get back. It wouldn't work. There's also talk of an attack perhaps from the Aleutian Islands. And the Aleutian Islands are further north, and the Aleutian Islands are actually closer to Japan than Hawaii is, although they're still a pretty far a long way. And so there's a possibility that something could happen there. But the Joint Chiefs kept shooting down his proposals. Roosevelt had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy for 7 years, and so he's really keen on the Navy and what could be done in the Navy. And so he kept pushing for the idea of, well, can we launch bombers off aircraft carriers? And so what became hatched was what's designated as Special Aviation Project Number 1. And that was the idea that somehow or another we could have bombers on our aircraft carriers be taken over to Japan to bomb the mainland. And this was assigned to Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, this Special Aviation Project Number 1. And the story is somewhat incredible, and even in the history books that I read, you can't read a military person's history without criticism of this raid that's going to be planned, because the raid did not have a sound military accomplishment. I mean, we didn't destroy any Japanese aircraft carriers, and we didn't destroy the fleet or attack the fleet, but we were designing a raid to go over Japan, and we were risking what little aircraft carriers we had to do that, and that's risky business to sail close to Japan. But Jimmy Doolittle did undertake this raid, which took place on April 17 of 1942. So it wasn't very long after Pearl Harbor. And it was done with the Hornet and the Enterprise. And they had specially made B-25 bombers. They stripped them down of all weight. They didn't even carry machine guns. And the bombers each had 5-man crew. And the 5-man crew would be on here, and each bomber had 4 bombs, 3 explosive bombs, and 1 incendiary bomb. And they loaded 8 bombers on the Hornet and 8 bombers on the Enterprise. And they sailed those bombers to get as close to Japan as possible. The design was to take off from the aircraft carriers when they're 500 miles away from Japan, and then land in the friendly airports in China, because we had an alliance with China. And so the idea couldn't go over here, but was to take off here, bomb Japan, and line in the land over here in friendly airports. The attack force approached Japan, and it was 650 miles away from Japan when it was spotted by a Japanese picket ship. That's a sentinel ship out there looking for the enemy. And so that caused some problems. There had to be a decision made whether to complete the mission, what would the Japanese do with this information. And so Jimmy Doolittle made the decision that he would launch early. So he was going to launch 150 miles earlier than the original plan. And that meant that there would not be enough fuel to make it to any of the airports. But nonetheless, that's what he did. And all 16 bombers successfully took off of these aircraft carriers. 8 on the Enterprise and 8 on the Hornet. And that's just somewhat incredible that a bomber could take off an aircraft carrier. And of course, Jimmy Doolittle was bomber number 1 on his aircraft carrier. He would have the shortest distance to go in taking off. All 16 bombers successfully flew across Japan. And 15 of the 16 bombers dropped their bombs the way they were supposed to. 1 didn't. And so the bombing raid, Doolittle raid, was tremendously successful in terms of attacking the Japanese homeland. Not a single bomber landed. There was not enough fuel to get to an airport. But most of the bombers did make it to Chinese territory, and they crash landed. And Doolittle and 68 of the other crew members, there were 80 crew members, each of the 16 had 5 crew members, Doolittle and 68 others parachuted out or crash landed safely. Three of the raiders, the Doolittle raiders, died in the crash landing. There were some captured by the Japanese. 3 were executed with a show trial, and 1 died in Japanese prison, but I think there was 3 or 4 that made it through the war in the Japanese prison. When this raid took place, Doolittle and his raiders were sheltered by the Chinese peasants, and they made their way back to the United States. When Doolittle came back to the United States, he thought he was going to get court-martialed for losing all of his aircraft, but instead he was given the Congressional Medal of Honor and promoted to Brigadier General. The raids were tremendously successful in getting Japan to understand that it was vulnerable on its own soil. Japanese airspace had been violated, and the concept of violating airspace wasn't even known at that time. One of the bombers, and I think 2 of these fellows are still alive because I follow the reports of them, but one of the bombers flew right over the palace for the Emperor Hirohito, and allegedly he flew 50 feet above the palace to help deliver his message. And the message got delivered. Japan launched a campaign against the Chinese peasants and the Chinese for giving shelter. And that campaign, the Chai-Chang campaign, I'm sure I didn't pronounce it right, ended up killing 250,000 Chinese civilians for their courtesy in protecting the American bombers. Damage was inconsequential in terms of doing damage to the fleet, but it changed the course of the war. Absolutely changed the course of the war, because now Japan's #1 mission was to protect its homeland. And the only way Japan can protect its homeland is to eliminate the one island that the United States still had possession of, and that was Midway Island, because Midway Island would determine who controlled the West Pacific. The Japanese reported the bombers and falsely reported the attacks on schools and hospitals. And FDR played it very, very coy. He was very, very quiet. And then finally the press kept asking him, where did these bombers come from that attacked Japan? Because it was known that there was an attack there. And in 1933, there was a best-selling novel written by James Hilton called Lost Horizon. And that novel referenced a fictional place called Shangri-La. And FDR's response at the press conference when he finally talked about the bombers was that they came from Shangri-La. So if you look at the history books, you'll see a lot of information about bombers coming from Shangri-La. Well, the full impact of this bombing hadn't taken place yet on the Japanese. It takes time to get coordinated. And in the meantime, Japan was very active in going after Australia. And so we had the great fortune of breaking the Japanese code. We had very skillful people involved in that, and Officer Rutherford is involved in that when he was on duty. But we broke the Japanese code, and we determined that the Japanese were sending 3 aircraft carriers to the Coral Sea. And the purpose of that was to prepare the invasion of Australia. Came very close to invading Australia. Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific for the United States, sent 2 of the aircraft carriers, the Yorktown and the Lexington, to engage the Japanese in the Battle of the Coral Sea. And this was the first battle. This took place May 4th to May 8th, just a couple weeks after the Doolittle raids. This was the first battle, naval battle, ever to take place where the enemy forces never saw each other. This would be a battle determined by aircraft carriers. The Coral Sea is down in this location off of Australia, and it was to soften the way for the Japanese troops to land in Australia. The reports on the Battle of the Coral Sea was really much a battle of confusion because of bad weather. There was a lot of rain squalls, and there were a lot of attacks by friendly fire. In fact, a number of times bombers launched from the coast of Japan, or coast of Australia, excuse me, bombers from Australia that were Allied bombers attacked our vessels because they couldn't recognize them. And it's also reported at one time the Japanese Zeros out on flights were trying to land, and they spotted the Yorktown, and they started circling the land on the Yorktown thinking it was a Japanese aircraft carrier. But it wasn't, and one of them got shot down, the rest went away. Finally, on May 8th, spotter planes from opposing forces saw each other about the same time. And we sank one of the 3 Japanese aircraft carriers on May 8th, and the Japanese sank the Lexington on May 8th. And so we lost a carrier, and they lost a carrier. The Japanese also did significant damage to the Yorktown. The Yorktown was severely crippled and could barely function, but it didn't sink. And so the Yorktown made course for Pearl Harbor to go back to get repaired. And it was able to make it back to Pearl Harbor, and it didn't sink, but it was certainly crippled and not functioning as it could have been. The historians tell us that basically the war in the Battle of the Coral Sea was a tie. And of course, with the number of aircraft carriers that both sides had, you can't really afford to have ties because we'd run out of aircraft carriers pretty quick. And that's where I want to give a quote from another film. If you watch the movie Midway, put out in 1976, there's a line where Admiral Nimitz, played by Henry Fonda, is speaking to Charlton Heston's character, Captain Matt Garth, and discussing the Coral Sea battle. He says, "We can't trade the Japanese carriers. We can't trade the Japanese carrier for carrier, Matt." That's just such an understatement. I mean, there's no way we could do that, but that's what happened. The Battle of the Coral Sea has kind of faded into obscurity to some degree, but not in Australia. The Aussies are very, very cognizant of the Battle of Australia, and they refer to that as the battle that saved Australia. Okay, the code breakers. We have a fortress in Hawaii working on breaking the Japanese code. There was assigned to that Joseph Rochefort, and he was incredibly brilliant. He was called a superb genius. And the Japanese code, I read a little bit about this, but it was assigned to large lists of numbers, of different words, and then each day the list would change. You'd start at a different location. And so it was a very, very difficult code to break. But we were using the rudiments of IBM computers at the time, and Rochefort, who had a little bit of Japanese background in terms of language skills, were able to start understanding their transmissions. The Japanese never broke our code, as you know. We had the Native Americans with the code talkers, and so we were successful there in maintaining our secrecy, but we were able to break the Japanese code. And it was, in fact, Rochefort who determined that those 3 aircraft carriers were going to battle the Coral Sea. But at this point in time, it became clear that the Japanese were making an all-out effort to do something. And the Japanese were making an all-out effort now to take Midway. We knew they were going to take something. We didn't know for sure, but we confirmed that through some test messages that were phony messages, and it came back. It was clear the Japanese were going to send basically all of its fleet to destroy the American presence on Midway Island. Rochefort had a desk at his station there, and it said, it had a sign above it that read, "We can accomplish anything provided no one cares who gets the credit." We can accomplish anything provided no one cares who gets the credit. And in a twist of irony, Rochefort is the one that discovered Midway Island was going to be the target of the attack. And this is not what his superiors thought was going to happen in Washington. And he was in fact correct. Nimitz recognized Rochefort's great success and says our success belongs to Rochefort, and nominated him for the Distinguished Service Medal. He did not get the Distinguished Service Medal, and he was removed from his position because of internal politics with the Washington bureaucracy. Eventually, 10 years after he died, he was posthumously given the Distinguished Service Medal as well as the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Reagan in 1986. When we learned that the attack was on Midway, we didn't have a lot of time to operate. And Nimitz made the decision to devote all of our resources on defending Midway. We only had, at this point, we only had 3 aircraft carriers because the Lexington was sunk. We only had 2 functional aircraft carriers, the Hornet and the Enterprise, and those are the 2 that carried off the raids, Doolittle raids. The Yorktown was severely crippled. When the Yorktown came into port at Pearl Harbor, it was only allowed to be there 72 hours, and they had to do what kind of repairs they could on it, and they immediately turned around and sent it to Midway. Nimitz was the commander of the Pacific, Chester W. Nimitz, and he made the decision to make a stand at Midway. His decision was challenged in Washington. Folks in Washington, there's a whole lot of paranoia going on in the United States because our entire West Coast felt vulnerable. The entire West Coast felt vulnerable because a Japanese aircraft carrier could sail up to the West Coast and launch its planes at any point in time, attacking Los Angeles, San Francisco, any of our cities on the West Coast. And so there was a lot of blackouts, a lot of paranoia about the Japanese coming to attack. And so Washington wanted aircraft carriers to protect San Francisco. Washington's superiors were convinced San Francisco was going to be a target. Back in Hawaii, Lieutenant General for the Army, Dolan Emmons, did not want aircraft carriers to leave Hawaii. He thought the Japanese would attack Pearl Harbor again and overtake Hawaii. And so what Nimitz was doing was making the decision to take all of our aircraft carriers and use them for defense of Midway, and leaving everything else vulnerable. There was also speculation that the Japanese might attack the Aleutian Islands, and they weren't going to do that. They wanted Midway because Midway would give them control of the Pacific. So I got to move this around a little bit. Now, this is not nearly as good as my student who did the other map. But what we have here is Midway. The command of the task force at Midway was given to Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance at that time, and he had not taken full command before, but he was competent, and he was in charge. He was already there with the Enterprise and the Hornet. They were fully functional. The Yorktown arrived at the location about 24 hours before the Battle of Midway. But when the Battle of Midway did take place, we had all 3 aircraft carriers there. The Japanese sent its entire fleet to attack Midway. Yamamoto stayed back with 6 aircraft carriers, or 5 aircraft carriers, and lots of support vessels, and also with troop transports that had 5,000 Japanese troops who would invade Midway and conquer that. And so Yamamoto stayed back some 500 miles from Midway, and he sent Nagumo. Admiral Nagumo is the same admiral who attacked Pearl Harbor. He was highly praised in his ability to move all the way across the Western Pacific undetected and bring the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. So he was their #1 battle champion. And so Nagumo led an attack force of 4 aircraft carriers against Midway Island. The code breakers, wrote for it, had actually picked up a code that indicated that the attack would come from the north. And so we had somewhat reliable information predicting that the attack would come from the north. You also have to understand that there's no radar at this time, and there's no way anybody could tell where the enemy is located unless you actually saw the enemy or you had intelligence about where the enemy is located. And so on the vessels at sea, absolute radio silence was maintained. They wouldn't communicate because their communications could be picked up. So as the vessels went to sea, there would not be any communications from the vessels, but the vessels could hear. Those on the vessels could hear transmissions elsewhere. And so under this code of silence, because you didn't want, you would give away your position if you started making transmissions. We kind of thought the Midway would be attacked on June 4th. On June 3rd, one of the spotter planes these are PBYs flown from Midway, spotted a Japanese vessel and followed it. Didn't find any aircraft carriers, but we were really tuned into what was going on. Now, let's talk about how you would locate the enemy. From Midway Island, these PBY planes would fly out in vectors, kind of like spokes on a bicycle wheel. And they would cover this whole area of the ocean, and they'd fly out as far as they could on their fuel, turn around and come back. They'll move over. Each one was assigned a 15-degree angle. They go out one end of the angle, cut over, and come back the other end of the angle. The morning of June 4th, we sent 22 PBY planes. There's actually 2 airports at Midway. There's 2 islands that are really close, and 11 flew out from each airport. And so these planes their sole purpose was to look for the enemy, the PBY planes. The plane assigned to the vector, which included the Japanese, was piloted by Captain Howard Addy, and he was extremely competent. He took off at 4:10 in the morning and flew out. A half hour before dawn, it takes a lot of time to cover this, not like today's jets or anything, it takes a lot of time to cover the distance. A half hour before dawn, Nagumo sent half of his planes on each of his aircraft carriers to Midway. And so as this Captain Addy is flying out, these planes are now flying toward Midway. And he starts running into these planes, or at least crossing paths with them. And he keeps flying. He makes very accurate reports as to exactly what he sees. And he first reports a single airplane, and then he reports many airplanes, and then he reports 2 aircraft carriers. He gave estimations as to speed and distance from Midway, and he did an incredible job doing what he was supposed to do. As he was making his reports, seemingly back to Midway, Admiral Spruance was hearing everything back on our task force. And so they were listening very closely under radio silence to the location of the enemy. And so when he finally reported the aircraft carriers, Spruance made the decision that they weren't close enough yet. They were about 180 miles away from where they thought the Japanese were. And that was at 6:30 in the morning. And so Spruance directed full speed ahead toward the location, sailed for 30 minutes to try to get closer. They felt like they were 150 miles away before they launched their planes. One of the things that Addy reported at one point in time at 5:44 a.m., he reported the famous mini planes heading Midway. And as a result of that radio transmission, the folks back at Midway took every functional plane and launched it. And so when the Japanese planes arrived at Midway Island, there wasn't a single functional plane on the ground. And not a single operational plane was destroyed or harmed in the attack on Midway. Although they bombed the dickens out of the island and the facilities there, none of our planes on Midway were hurt. When Spruance got to the point where he needed to launch, he made the decision to take everything he had and throw it at the Japanese. And so he took all of the planes from the Hornet, put them in the air, all of the planes from the Enterprise, put them in the air, and took half of the planes from the Yorktown. He did keep half of the planes back home as fighter protection for the ships. So basically he launched everything in an all or nothing effort to stop the Japanese. Well, there's three types of planes that have been launched. They're going to be launched. We have torpedo planes, which are incredibly slow. They carry a very long torpedo as a single munition under their belly, and these have a pilot and a gunner. And these planes fly very low to the ocean. And these are the most effective planes to attack ships because if dropped appropriately, the torpedo can go into the hull of the ship and destroy the metal hull and cause it to sink. We had 3 squadrons of torpedo planes that were launched. The torpedo planes are the slowest, and so they were launched first off the aircraft carriers. The other type of attack plane that we had were the dive bombers. And the dive bombers would sail very high up, 12,000 feet, and when they spot a target, then just like it sounds, they'd come diving down like a bird, and then when they get close, they drop the bomb, and then they go back up and regain altitude. We sent dive bombers from the Hornet, the Enterprise, and the Yorktown. And then the other type of plane was the fighter. And the fighter was not designed to attack the enemy, but designed to be defensive for the planes that we're sending. The story now goes to the Hornet, a critical story there involving John Waldron, a Sioux Indian from Fort Pierre, South Dakota. He led Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet. And he had a very strong disagreement with the superior of the Hornet, the Hornet Air Commander, commander for the Hornet air operations that morning, because the location of the Japanese, Waldron predicted, had changed from what it was when it was first reported by Captain Addy. And he was convinced that they would have moved into another direction. And he says that's where we should go. The Hornet, the commander of the Hornet Enterprise, Hornet operation, disagreed. And they came to words that weren't pleasant, and they parted and they took off. Also, because for whatever reason, the commander of the Hornet was going to take the dive bombers, and he kept the fighters to protect the dive bombers. And so the fighters escorted the dive bombers from the Hornet, and so that meant the torpedo planes had no fighter protection. Shortly after they launched, when they're out at sea, Waldron made the decision to go in the direction of his initial instincts. And he veered off away from the direction that the commander was going. And if you watch, I won't quote the language, but if you watch the Battle of Midway, there's discussion on the radio by the pilots there on the torpedo squadrons. They say, well, this guy's going in a different direction. Oh, trust him, he's a Sioux Indian. He knows what he's doing. So all of the torpedo planes followed Waldron, and he found the Japanese fleet. He took all 3 squadrons to the Japanese. The bombers, the dive bombers from the Hornet, never found the Japanese. They ended up flying to Midway Island, and they didn't participate in the events that day. But John Waldron led the Americans to the Japanese fleet with his. He became one of the first casualties of the war. We sent 41 torpedo planes to the Japanese carriers, and 35 of the 41 torpedo planes were shot down. Not a single torpedo landed on a target, not a single one. Every one of the torpedo planes were shot down by the Japanese Zeros in the air, high in the air at 20,000 feet, protecting the aircraft carriers. And it was very easy targets, especially since there were no fighter protections for the torpedo planes, and they just would swoop down. The only survivor, 68 flyers were killed that day from the torpedo squadrons, and the only survivor is this George Gay. And he was shot twice, but he managed to land his plane in such a way that it didn't kill him, and he floated on a piece of wreckage to watch what happened. Lo and behold, as these fighters, the Japanese Zeros, were knocking down all of our torpedo planes, we have squadrons of dive bombers from both the Yorktown and the Enterprise in the air. And both of these squadrons arrive on the site almost simultaneously with the defeat of our torpedo planes. And so we have two dive bomber squadrons arriving on the site, and there is no fighter protection for the aircraft carriers because they're all at very low altitude, and they can't stop the dive bombers. There's another little twist in this that I need to mention. Admiral Nagumo, when he launched his planes to Midway, he saved the other half of his planes in case any American aircraft carriers were spotted. Because these aircraft carriers, or these planes that he saved, had torpedo bombs on them that would be used against ships, aircraft carriers. And he also had spotter planes that went out looking for the enemy, but the plane assigned to the sector where our carriers was, for some reason took off a half hour late. It had mechanical difficulty. It didn't take off on the same time as the other ones. And when it spotted American vessels, it never reported an aircraft carrier. All it reported were cruisers and destroyers. So Nagumo had a false sense of confidence, and he felt like there were no aircraft carriers around, and what he wanted to do was to take these remaining planes and rearm them with land-based bombs, not torpedoes, so he could send a second strike at Midway. And so that's what he did. He ordered that all of the existing planes, the half that he didn't send, ordered them, there's 212 altogether, so he ordered the other half, the torpedoes be taken off, and the land-based bombs be put on them. Well, they took the torpedoes off, and they put them on the decks, and then they put the land-based bombs on. And so sitting on the decks of these aircraft carriers are all these bombs, torpedo bombs and the land-based bombs. And then when he saw the torpedo squadrons come, and they were shooting them down, he figured, well, we do have aircraft carriers. So then he ordered them to put the torpedoes back on. And so none of the bombs were put in protection below the decks. And when these dive bomber squadrons arrived from the Enterprise and the Yorktown, they had a field day. And within a 6-minute period, all three of these Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk by the dive bombers, from 10:24 a.m. to 10:28 a.m. or 10:29 a.m. It's just incredible. And George Gay was a witness to this. And of course, it didn't take much because just like what happened on the Arizona, the Japanese own munitions accelerated the impact of the Americans' bombs. And so all three of these aircraft carriers were sunk in a 6-minute period. The fourth aircraft carrier was located 10 miles north, and it didn't get sunk that day, but it did get sunk the next day. Our bombers found it the next day and sank it. So it did go. Unfortunately, the fourth aircraft carrier sent planes to our carriers. And our carriers that are functional, the Hornet and the Enterprise, were able to outmaneuver and avoid a disaster. But the Yorktown was crippled, and she was lost in the Battle of Midway. The Yorktown went down. the losses at the Battle of Midway. Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers. We lost 1, the Yorktown. Japanese lost 322 planes. We lost 147 planes. Japanese lost 3,500 lives. We lost 347 lives. The Battle of Midway was a battle that we never should have won. It was a battle against unbelievable odds. There's so much that can be said about what if and what if this had happened. What if Nagumo had dedicated more than 4 aircraft carriers to the attack? If he had dedicated 6 or 8, 6 like he sent to Pearl Harbor, then they would have been around to wipe out the American fleet. But Yamamoto didn't do that, and so we had an incredible victory. We didn't know how big the Japanese force was, and so there was the notion, even Nimitz thought we could find the rest of the force and eliminate them. Well, we didn't know that this was only less than half of what they had. And so they did send the Enterprise under the command of Ray Spruance to find the rest of the fleet. And he went out and started to do that, but then he soon realized that his fuel supplies were bad, and he's being put in a bad position because he might have a nighttime engagement, and his pilots had no experience in landing planes on carrier decks at nighttime. And so Spruance made the decision not to pursue the Japanese further. He was criticized at the time for giving up, but his decision was absolutely the wisest decision that could have been made, because had he pursued the Japanese aircraft carriers, I think there's a really good chance that we would have lost the Enterprise and been in worse shape because of that. Oh, well, John Waldron from Fort Pierre, South Dakota. There's a bridge over the Missouri River that connects Fort Pierre with Pierre, and it's named after John Waldron. He's truly one of the heroes of the Battle of Midway, although he died in the battle. I had a former student send me an article from the Capital Journal in Pierre that ran on August 18th of 2000, and that would have been his 100th birthday had he lived. And I usually read most of this article to the students, but I want to read just a part of this article in this presentation here, and it's talking about his accomplishments. And part of it's going to quote George Gay, who is his sole survivor. The morning briefing of June 4th was tense on the Hornet. The Americans knew they were facing overwhelming odds in terms of both ships and flying experience. They would not know that they had been given the greatest possible advantage in advance with the breaking of the Japanese code that had revealed Japan's plans for Midway. When they scrambled to the carrier's decks from the ready room, Waldron pulled young George Gay from Texas, the squadron navigator, aside and told Gay to track him so that Gay could bring the squadron home if anything happened to him. Waldron had just had a vehement argument with the Hornet's overall air group commander and was convinced that his own estimate of the Japanese location and path was accurate. When they did take off, they did so without fighter escort, though Waldron had pleaded for some form of fighter escort. They could not be spared, though, and instead were meant to escort the SPD Dauntless dive bombers. Torpedo Squadron 8 was flying into combat for the first time on its own. After a period of time, Waldron made his fateful decision to bank his planes in the direction of the original instincts. Meanwhile, the Hornet's air group commander, flying his squadron of dive bombers, flew onto Midway Island after missing the Japanese fleet and did not participate at all in that morning's events. Waldron had been right. Eventually, Waldron found the target, 3 Japanese aircraft carriers and numerous escort ships. But soon thereafter, a much more immediate threat appeared. About 30 Japanese Zeros with flying speeds 3 times as fast as the torpedo planes swarmed down from their defensive positions high above their fleet onto the VT-8 flying at wave top level. According to George Gay, the last transmission from Waldron was, quote, "We will go in, we won't turn back, former strategy cannot be used, we will attack, good luck." The only modern comparison to the slaughter that then occurred would be if 30 helicopter gunships attacked 15 cars driving in tight formation along Interstate 90. VT-8 went quickly down, some nosediving into the water with the same effect as hitting concrete at more than 100 miles an hour, while others exploded in the air. All 15 planes were lost and 29 of 30 men were perished. John Waldron was one of the first casualties. George Gay reported later that when he looked over, he saw Waldron attempting to step out of his burning cockpit just as the plane nosed into the water. Every other plane suffered a similar fate except Gay's. His rear gunner shot dead, shot twice himself, and his plane shot to shreds. He managed to crash his plane into the water and bail out. If the story had ended there, it would be simple to call it a tragic, maybe even wasteful loss. However, the loss of Torpedo Squadron 8 and the near total destruction of Torpedo Squadrons 3 and 6 from the Yorktown and Enterprise were not to be in vain. The Japanese had pulled the entire combat air patrol down from 20,000 feet to pounce on the Americans. In the precious minutes that it took the Zeros to regain their patrol altitude, the American dive bombers from the Enterprise and the Yorktown arrived nearly simultaneously over 3 of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. In the next few minutes, the carriers Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu were racked with multiple bomb hits. Japanese pilots were blasted off the decks while sitting in their planes preparing to take off. The Hiryu would not be sunk until later that afternoon or the next day, and only after it had delivered a crippling blow to the Yorktown. One other choice piece of information on this battle. Get back to my picture here. The Yorktown's planes took off much later than the other ones. They took off about an hour later. And they had the benefit of knowing where the Japanese had been located because Waldron had found them. And so their dive bombers happened to arrive at the right time. From the Enterprise, however, Wade McCuskey, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCuskey, led that squadron of dive bombers. And he had been out looking for the enemy unsuccessfully and was dangerously low on fuel, not being able to get back to the aircraft carriers. And right when he was ready to turn back, he found a Japanese cruiser. And the Japanese cruiser was headed in a certain direction. And he made the guess that the Japanese cruiser was headed to the aircraft carriers. And so even though his planes were dangerously low on fuel, he followed the direction of that Japanese cruiser. And so he was able to join and arrive at the same time as the Yorktown's dive bombers. And so the heroism that he exhibited in flying a risky mission in terms of loss of fuel and able to get back, he found them shortly and happened to be at the right place at the right time to help deliver a crippling blow. All right. Battle of Midway was June 4, 1942. It actually lasted for a couple days, so it ended about June 6th to June 7th in 1942, which is exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. So why am I obsessed with this? I am obsessed with it. Absolutely. I don't know. We won a victory that we never should have won. The odds were stacked against us, and we didn't even know how bad it was. And so I'm just the more I look at it, the more I have to look at it. And that's why I've been doing this over the years. How did we win? Well, we redefined the playing field by the use of the Doolittle raids. And we stopped the Japanese aggression. After the Battle of Midway, the Japanese aggression were never aggressive again. It was all a defensive battle by the Japanese, with us trying to retake the islands, retake the land. Eventually, World War II in the Pacific ended because we could drop atomic bombs on Japanese soil. Had we lost Midway, we would not be able to control the Western Pacific, and it's doubtful that an American plane could ever reach Japanese soil. So that was critical in being able to deliver those bombs. We all, sometimes in litigation and get involved in conflict, you're always looking for that silver bullet. You're always looking for the one or two heroes. How did they win this? And that's kind of the nature of my inquiry in the beginning, was let's find the one thing or the one or two things or the one or two heroes that dictated the result. And the more I've studied this, the more I've become convinced that the heroes aren't one or two or three or four or five or six. The heroes are in the numbers of tens and hundreds of thousands of men. Men doing what they were supposed to be doing exactly the way they're supposed to be doing it. Carrying out orders, performing their mission. You just see it over and over again. You look at Captain Addy, who just did a competent, thorough job of flying the PBY plane. You look at Commander Rochefort, who broke the Japanese code. That was what he was assigned to do. He had a sign over his desk that said, "We can accomplish anything provided no one cares who gets the credit." Well, he accomplished everything, and he didn't get credit for it. What a twist of irony there. And so as I reflect on that, I come to a broader, wider sensation in that the heroes aren't just the ones that served in the Pacific. The heroes are with us today, and it's every veteran who is doing what he or she did or is doing now, or any soldier who's doing what he or she did or has done what he or she was supposed to do. And that's the American spirit. That's the American spirit, is to go into this conflict with what we have. We couldn't wait till these other 11 aircraft carriers were manufactured, but we used American ingenuity and American spirit. And I firmly believe that those who, truly some deserve greater recognition because of their outstanding accomplishments, like John Waldron, like Rochefort, like Wade McCuskey, like Jimmy Doolittle. Truly they deserve that. But you know, for those who died at Pearl Harbor, who died, you know, how can a person ever justify and come to grips with understanding why people die? You know, why did Waldron die and why did the others live? Why did the people die at Pearl Harbor who didn't do anything? They were attacked innocently. And the thing that I've learned is that, and I have friends in Yankton that talk about this every now and then at the meetings I get together with, I don't have to know why. I just have to accept what's happened. And if I can accept what happens, then I can become productive and effective in what I do. And so instead of wasting time asking questions why, you know, I need to move forward. And I think that's what those who've died in service want us to do. I think that's what they want all of the other soldiers and sailors and Marines and Air Force people to do, is to move forward and to appreciate and respect what happened to them, but not alter their course, because their course is the same course that they were on. And so, you know, I'm just, you know, I continue to be obsessed with this. How do I bring this to an end? I don't know. But I got to do that. So I think I'll bring it to an end. Thank you.